Thank you, President. Now we switch to English, and we have a very distinguished guest with us, Senior European Union Ambassador João Vale de Almeida. João Vale de Almeida is a Senior European Union Ambassador who very recently retired after a 40 years remarkable international career. He was last posted in London as the first EU Ambassador to the United Kingdom after Brexit. Previously, he was Ambassador to the United Nations and Ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Vale de Almeida has a vast experience in European and international affairs, including as EU's Sherpa for G8 and G20 summits, and Chief of Staff of the President of the European Commission. Ambassador de Almeida, we welcome you in our Greek Economic Summit. We all are looking forward to hearing your views about Europe and its course towards the future, the prospects of the transatlantic relations, given the latest developments in the other side of the Atlantic, and where is the world heading to amidst a very disruptive environment we're experiencing. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elias. Thank you, all of you. Good morning. First of all, great to be in Greece. Not very often, but I want to come back, that's for sure. And thank you for inviting me today. Elias asked me to make a tour of the world in 15 minutes, which I will try to do in a way that leaves you with some words for further reflection. But first, let me start by thanking the President for the invitation and the Chamber. I know the quality work that you've been doing for the last decades, and I know that will continue. And I think it's very important that in a conference like this, you include a reflection about the state of the world and the extent to which Greece is impacted by it. So in my 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation with Elias that I think will allow us to deepen some of our issues. I would like to leave you with 5 things to worry about and 3 pieces of advice. What should you worry about? And by you, I mean people engaged in government, students, I understand, who are here as well, but particularly business people. If you look at the world today, what should you worry about? So my 5 points. The first one is a crisis of governance. Global governance, to begin with. We are going through, I believe, the most difficult, most serious crisis of the international order that we set up after the Second World War, which was reinforced after the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. This is a global crisis of governance where things that we thought were guaranteed, things that we took for granted, like you should not violate the territorial integrity of a member of the United Nations, particularly if you are a permanent member of the Security Council of the same United Nations, but also governance crises at the national level. In a number of our countries, populist forces, mostly from the right, but some from the left, are challenging the way governance is applied, are challenging some of the fundamental values of living together in a democratic society. And this is disturbing in a number of our countries, the way governments interact with citizens and business. So there's definitely a governance crisis ongoing. Secondly, there are serious geopolitical tensions in today's world that we haven't seen for many decades. The most obvious one is, of course, what is happening in Ukraine, where there was an unjustified, unlawful, unprovoked aggression and invasion by the Russian Federation. What goes on in the Middle East, where The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, of course, still ongoing, and they've developed into open violence. But we also have the situation in Syria in the last couple of days, the tensions between, and the open conflict, in fact, between Israel and Iran, the tensions across the Gulf in a general terms. This crisis is not as systemic as the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, but of course it happens in our neighborhood, and particularly in Greece's neighborhood. And it has obviously an impact on Europe. Situation in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, and the attitudes and the behavior of China are, of course, a permanent source of tension. And, given the Beijing position, this could, in the future, become even more complicated. Speaking of China, we have an element of this global landscape, which is the increasing, growing rivalry between the United States and China. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Since then, it has become a major global trading and economic power. It now clearly aspires to have more than that. The United States, who has been hegemonic power for many decades, of course, resents that. The tensions are building up. We'll see what happens with the next administration. But this is something that should not be seen as something very far away from us Europeans or from us Greeks. This has, of course, an impact in the whole system of governance of the world. And this will mean, for instance, that our American friends will certainly call on their allies, including us, to follow some of their actions as far as China is concerned. We'll see what happens there, but this is clearly a new reality, the US-China rivalry. Let's go how far it goes. And then you have, the growing opposition between the West, if you want to call it that way. That's referred to the G7 as being the hub where Western liberal countries meet, and a group of countries around the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And more worryingly, the recent alliance or axis, which I call the CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This is very worrying. This can have serious repercussions in the stability of our planet. The third thing I think you should worry about is the geoeconomic tensions. And here you have a situation in which we are coming out of a period, what I call hyper-globalization, where in fact trade grew more than GDP, which is coming to a pause, or at least a reconversion into something else that we don't know yet exactly what it would look like. But within this transition, there are serious risks involved here. For me, the most important one is what we could call decoupling, meaning that instead of having a global economy with all its interdependence, interconnections around basically the same rules of behavior, we could have a decoupling, a separation between groups of countries. You could imagine China and their satellites, I would call it that way, having a system of their own, different from, let's say, the Western one. This is particularly worrying for countries like ours in Europe, who depend largely on export-oriented growth. If the world is split, it's not good for those who try to export to the entire globe like you do here in Greece. But the most obvious threat as we speak is the one of trade wars. Trade conflicts between the most important trading partners of the world. And we have seen some elements of that in the last few years, coming, for instance, from the United States under the Biden administration. Mr. Trump has announced even more serious and more detrimental measures that could affect free trade. We'll see what happens in reality. But if I had to establish one for you business people, one main concern, most immediate one, will be this one. Are we heading towards a trade war between the US and China, between the US and the EU, between the US, Canada, and Mexico? What is going to happen? Tariffs are not good for anybody. They are not the solution for any problem, and they can cause huge damage to export-oriented economies like ours. And a more philosophical question or issue around this is what will happen to globalization as we knew it? Globalization is the result, in my view, of two factors: technology and aspiration. Technology provided us the means to be interconnected, interdependent, to live in a global marketplace. But the driving force was, and still is, I believe, the aspiration of people around the world to have better lives. And so what are we going to do? What is going to happen to this globalization that is now being impacted by the need for some countries that they feel to protect themselves with the rise of protectionism? We'll see, but this is something I think that should worry you. My fourth point will be US unilateralism. The United States historically has fluctuated between internationalism and isolationism. What I see coming down the road, if I interpret well Mr. Trump's agenda, is rather that the US could become seriously unilateralist. And by this I mean that they will pay less attention to multilateral mechanisms, United Nations, World Trade Organization, all sorts of international bodies that were created after the Second World War and later in the 20th century to organize a global cooperation and recently a global economy. If the US opts for what I call a unilateralist, I don't think they will become isolationists as such, but a dimension of unilateralism, meaning that the US goes on its own, favors bilateral links as opposed to multilateral ones, does not really believe in international rules and norms or treaties or organizations, this will not be easy for us in Europe to handle. The European Union is the best expression of regional globalization. It's the best expression of solving common problems through common solutions. If the US, which is a major partner of ours, opts for a new unilateralist agenda, this will make things more difficult to handle. And my fifth point is a serious one, which is about nuclear proliferation. I think we are in a moment where, first of all, Mr. Putin has been threatening the use of nuclear weapons, which is not a good thing as such, not a reassuring prospect. But in the current context, I see new actors in the nuclear field feeling empowered, emboldened, and encouraged to develop their own nuclear military capabilities. I can think of Iran, I can think of North Korea, but I can also think of other players, middle powers that may be tempted for all sorts of reasons, but linked to the volatility of the present international context, to develop their own capabilities. As far as the old actors, the old nuclear powers are concerned, they will feel the need to catch up as far as the new players come into the nuclear scene with more recent technology. So we could easily, hopefully not, be in the process of a nuclear capability building up around the world. And at the same time, as we know, some of the mechanisms of regulation, some of the mechanisms of control and monitoring that used to exist during, namely, the Cold War, have been weakened. And so the combination of all this is something that worries me a little bit, and I wanted to share this concern with all of you, because I think this is part of the current global context. Now, a couple of advice, if I can call it that way. How should we all handle this situation? What should be my advice to business people in Europe in addressing the current context? I think the first point will be to be aware and alert. This is the time where a serious businessman or businesswoman cannot sit in his corner, his or her corner, little market, and simply wait for the trouble to go away. I think this is a moment where you need to be alert and aware of what you need to do to address the risks that are involved. So I think discussions like this initiative that you have here should happen more often, so that people exchange information about the way they feel about the markets, about the threats and the risks, but also the opportunities that exist. And the second point is to talk to your politicians. Some will come here throughout the day, if I understand correctly. I think maybe more than ever, politicians need to listen to their business people. And I think the message I would pass to them if I was a businessman would be to say, try to find pragmatic solutions and don't exacerbate the problems that already exist by sticking to very narrow and firm positions. I think politicians need to prove they can handle this difficult situation. I'm talking about globally, of course, where I think the main leaders of the world should show willingness to overcome differences and try to find common ground. I hope that will be the case as we start a new cycle also on the US side. But also at national level, with the threat of populism, I think the moderate forces of center-left, center, and center-right should rise to the occasion and create degrees of consensus that allow them to resist the agenda of populists, and particularly provide questions for the concerns of the citizens that vote for populists. And I think this is a major agenda. And I think from a business point of view, what you want is solutions, is pragmatic action, is allowing you to prosper with political stability, security, and competitiveness. And my third point will be to protect transatlantic relations, invest in and protect the relevance of transatlantic relations. I'm a staunch transatlanticist. I was ambassador to the United States. I lived in the US for almost 10 years in 2 ambassadorial positions. My country, Portugal, is the closest you get to the United States. If you are in Europe, we have a discussion with Ireland about that, but we are the, if you swim from New York eastward, you get to Lisbon. So I don't advise you to do that necessarily. But so for all these reasons, I'm very attached to the transatlantic relationship. And I would not like to see this relationship being put in question by whatever decisions are taken. And I would not like to see this relationship being the victim of what I call the race to the bottom, be it on military spending, withdrawal from the US, of the US from Europe and NATO, or on the economic side, by creating tension on the trade across the Atlantic, or, for that matter, because of the Chinese factor, putting pressure on Europeans to follow the United States' radical agenda regarding trade with China. Because we are, Europeans, much more vulnerable, much more dependent upon our relationship with China than the US is. So five issues for concern, 3 pieces of advice. I hope this can make you be more interested by the global situation, and I'm sure in my conversation with Elias we can go deeper into some of these points. Thank you very much.
Please have number 3 here. Well, Ambassador, that was a very, very enlightening address, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed your speech and took your advices, actually. By the way, something that I noticed is, despite the fact that some things are of major concern, you're still smiling. You believe that it seems that you're very optimistic. Is that true? Despite all these challenges, all this...
Well, I smile because what's the point of not smiling?
Of course.
What's the point of being pessimistic and depressed? No, I think if there's one issue that we have in Western societies, I would say, is that we are not self-confident enough about the beauty of democracy, about the beauty of fundamental human rights, the rule of law, and I think we should be more consistent with our belief that this is, with all its vulnerabilities and imperfections, the best governance system that we have. And today's world is being challenged. Our system is being challenged. Countries are being tempted to follow other models, more autocratic, less liberal. And I basically think we should fight back, push back, and to do that effectively, you need to believe. You need to be not unrealistically optimistic, which I'm not, but realistically optimistic, which is what I try to be.
Yeah. You mentioned before about, the politicians should be pragmatic, and also the business should be alert. Speaking about the first part, do you see the politicians, especially European, try, to become pragmatic, given all this uncertainty, all this internal, sometimes social cohesion? Sometimes we have the impression that they are using, they're trying, to hide the problems under the carpet, So the term will finish and then we'll go again. So
it's not easy to be, as I observe, it's not easy to be a politician these days. It's not easy to be a political leader these days. I mean, you imagine that you have, constant elections to win. I mean, take the case of the US. The US has elections every 2 years. in 2 years' time, they will elect a new House of Representatives and 1/3 of senators. 2 years. In Europe, you have slightly longer electoral cycles, but still, every 4 or 5 years, or even less, you are forced to go in front of voters. Okay, this is democracy, and that's good. But if you add to that the pressure of social media, the pressure of a 24 hours news cycle, the scrutiny, the intense scrutiny on politicians, so it's maybe why I'll never be a politician, but I have to respect the difficulties political leaders have today in managing their position. This being said, I think it's their responsibility to do two things, in my view. First, to fight back on those who want alternative systems to democracy. And secondly, to fight those within the system that, in fact, are undermining it. And that's what I call the populists. People that provide simple solutions for complex problems. That's very easy. That's very attractive.
Without having been tested.
How are you going to pay for that? What is the downside of that measure? But it sounds nice, and people follow, and that's a major issue, major difficulty, a major obstacle for the slow running of a government business. So but still, I think that's what I said, that I thought business people should do, is to put pressure on leaders, political leaders and governments to do the right thing, even if it's not necessarily immediately popular, because what is at stake is very important.
Yes. In a period of rapid technological innovation and shifting economic power, what steps must Europe, you think, should take to remain competitive on the global stage, particularly against US and China, if we have any chance, by the way?
Yeah, Mario Draghi just produced a report, which I recommend that you try to read, at least the executive summary. It's a very good diagnosis, analysis of Europe's issues in terms of competitiveness, innovation, our place in the world compared exactly to the US and China. So it's a good diagnosis, a good analysis. It provides a number of recommendations. I'm not sure all of them are implementable soon, but at least they give you a sense of direction. And it's all about us being able to do, make compatible a number of objectives, which are not necessarily easy to accommodate in a single strategy. I think the most obvious one now, for the reasons I briefly highlighted, is security and defense. So how can Europe be more effective, more autonomous, more capable of defending itself in case of trouble? And God knows we have a clear threat coming from Mr. Putin, but we may have others in the future. And we are, up to now, very dependent upon the United States. So this is the first. So how do you do that? How do you finance that? How do you do that in an optimal way at European level instead of each country on its own? The second one is innovation. We are, to a large extent, lagging behind the United States and China on innovation capabilities. We need to do something about it. We are not less intelligent than Americans or Chinese. What we are is that our effort is separated, divided. We are not creating the critical mass, and we are not able to transform innovative ideas into economic realities. And we are not giving innovators the capital they need. People with good ideas today go to the US, to California, to Silicon Valley, or to Wall Street to get the money they need to develop their ideas.
Even business are going right now because of the incentives.
And now, of course, the incentives. And that brings me to the third point, which is how do you do all this while implementing a very ambitious climate change agenda, climate action, net zero agenda, which is, of course, fundamental for the future of the globe, but raises a number of difficult issues for us. So how do you bring all this together and close the gap that exists either in economic terms or competitiveness terms between us and the US and in certain areas with China?
Well, maybe this question it comes after what you just said. How can Europe balance its strong regulatory framework with the need to foster innovation and growth in key industries like green technology, artificial intelligence, and digital transformation? I think we all acknowledge that Europe is very slow in terms of regulatory framework. And maybe this is a fundamental difference with US particularly.
Yeah, I mean, we need regulation because we need the single market to operate, right? If you have 27 economies that are working as one, for that to work, you need to have regulations that are applied across the board. So it's not because my colleagues in Brussels are obsessed with regulation, it's because if a Greek producer wants to sell in Portugal, he has to apply, and vice versa, the same rules, and that gives you the possibility to work for a 450 million consumer market. So regulation is necessary. The question is the degree and the intensity and the depth of this regulation. I think there's an issue, and Mrs. von der Leyen has put this on her new Commission agenda, an issue of simplification, an issue of streamlining. And, many investors, foreign investors that come to Europe, I'm sure in Greece the same, they are confronted with excessive bureaucracy. Some of it is European, but I must say in defense of Brussels that most of it is national, right? What we call the gold plating. So you have a directive or a regulation agreed in Brussels by all the 27, and then when it is applied and transposed to the national legislation, people tend to add things to it, to make it even more complicated. So the simplification and the streamlining has to begin when you produce the regulation, which is basically in Brussels, Strasbourg, between the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission, but also at national level. So this is the kind of pressure that I think business people can put on governments, on Brussels, and in case in Athens, and in all the other capitals, so that that simplification is done at the service of business. But the other aspect where I think we need to do more and better is in the capitals market, as I was saying earlier. And this needs to be done at European level for obvious reasons. And it's also part of the agenda of the Commission that started yesterday. And I think this is something business people should push for, because this will give you the capacity to finance your investments, finance your projects, finance your innovation. And this is something that we need to do at European level. We also need to look at our competition policy and see whether or not we need maybe to change the focus or recalibrate the concerns that we have. But in doing all this, I think there's a risk we should avoid, which is the protectionist risk.
Correct.
And America is on a protectionist trend today, even with the Biden administration. The Biden administration, correct me if I'm wrong, the Americans in the room, didn't do much in terms of trade policy or new trade deals with the rest of the world. The Trump administration is not likely to do that at all. It may be even likely to reverse some of those, if I hear what has been said about Mexico and Canada, for instance, not to mention China. So if there is a protectionist trend in America, the worst thing for me will be to reply to that with a protectionist trend in Europe. We'll both lose. I mean, the worst case scenario for me is America first versus Europe first.
Of course.
I think it will mean America last and Europe last. So while we have to do all these things to become more competitive, to increase our economic security, because in some areas we are excessively dependent from the outside, we should do that while avoiding the protectionist trap, because that will not be good for any of our economies, and if I may say so, I'm sure not for the Greek economy either, sure, because your economy, like the one of my country, is, of course, absolutely open and largely dependent on export and open trade and open lines of commerce and exchanges. So we should, again, while doing everything to become more competitive, to protect ourselves from the bad things done by others, we should avoid repeating bad things done by us as well.
I have a last question for you. How do you translate the fact that President Trump has announced tariffs for Canada, for Mexico, for China, and he hasn't mentioned anything about, Europe? Why is that? Maybe he expects something from Europe? Maybe because of the Ukraine issue?
In this initial stage, we are still in the transition phase between one president and the other. The less he speaks about Europe, the better. So I'm very happy with silence on that front. Now, more seriously, I think conversations have already taken place, because we know, not me, but, well, I actually know him, but I'm not in position of power, but leaders in Europe know Donald J. Trump, right? Because they had to deal with him for 5 years, for 4 years, sorry. So we know him as a person, we know him as a leader. Of course, 2016 is different from 2025, as he will start. Europe is different from where we were. The world is very different, as I tried to highlight. So we cannot transpose simply what happened during his first mandate and what will happen now. But still, I think some of our leaders have engaged with him at that point in time. Conversations have already taken place in recent weeks. And my hope is that we can find a platform of understanding where we both realize that there are too many things that we have in common, values and interests, that should guide us to avoid creating too much of a clash across the Atlantic. I hope that's valid for trade. I hope that's valid for defense and security. But again, if there's one thing that characterizes the president-elect, is that he's quite unpredictable. So I reserve my judgment. If you invite me another time, maybe we can take stock of where we are. But let me finish by thanking you for your attention, but also encouraging you to, as business people and politicians and citizens, to continue to follow what goes on around the world, because increasingly it will have an impact in your country and in your activities.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation we had. I'm sure that everybody also enjoyed, and we really appreciate that you were part of our Greek Economic Summit.
Thank you very much.
So, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.